So welcome to those of you at mochurch.tv. Turn to Ephesians chapter 5. You can download the Bible app for free. I'm Dan Smith. I'm the lead minister at Momentum.
I am Shannon, his wife of 24 years, and we have 3 kids.
Yeah, which says godly character to be married to me for 24 years. So Tim Keller, he's a pastor, retired pastor now, has a book that we're going to refer to, especially here at the beginning, that has a chapter on commitment. The book is called The Meaning of Marriage, and chapter 3 is on commitment specifically, which is what we're talking about this morning, how love handles commitment. And the whole time I was reading this book, and specifically this chapter, I was in the living room, and Shannon was sitting in there. I was like, dang, Shannon, this chapter is fire. It's fire. It's about commitment. It's fire. And so really, the whole book is good. It is the best book I've read on Christian marriage, and there's a ton in there. I was surprised how much was in there for single people also.
Yeah, he really did talk about how on fire this book was over and over.
Fire.
So one thing that Keller does is he describes 2 different types of relationships. And the first one that he does is this one that we all know about. It's consumer relationships. It's the relationships we have with businesses, right? And the consumer relationship is the kind that only lasts as long as the business meets my needs or it's acceptable to me, until another vendor comes along and maybe they have a better product at a better price, and then we have no obligation to stay with the first vendor. So in a consumer relationship, you could say that the individual's needs are more important than the relationship as a whole, right?
And I've noticed this with my mom. I might pick on the older generation
Oh, poor Debbie.
just a touch. But my mom, who is retired and lives in Florida, where all retired people live, I've noticed this with her and local restaurants. So sometimes I'll talk to her on the phone, or I'll go visit her, and she'll say, oh, Dan. And now, by the way, she's inherited my voice I did from my grandmother, her mom. She's getting to that age where I'm starting to use that voice for her. And so she said, oh, Dan, we had this restaurant we were thinking about taking you to, but we just don't go there anymore. And there's always a main topic, a main theme of why they don't go to this restaurant anymore. And it has to do with portion sizes. Oh, their portions just got so small. And she always uses one particular word. They're starting to get chintzy. Now, if you're feeling like this is hitting home, I'm talking to a specific generation right now. And so she's like, oh, they're just so stingy. Really, I mean, my mom barely eats half of her meal anyway. So this means she doesn't get to take as much home in the to-go box now. But she ends relationships with restaurants eventually because those portion sizes, they just start getting so small. So we moved on to another place, which is wonderful. They're not as chintzy or stingy. And so that's the thing. I'm prepared, by the way, in the next 20 years, this is going to become a much bigger issue for me, apparently. You know, you hit a certain age and portion size is what it's all about. So in a consumer relationship, though, that's how things work. Like if I'm taking a loss, if I'm taking an L, then it's no longer meeting my needs, then I'm out.
Yeah, the second type of relationship that Keller talked about is what he called the covenantal relationship. And those are relationships that you might be in with people. They are binding, right? It means that the relationship as a whole takes precedence more than my individual needs. And so it's interesting because sociologists argue that in like our contemporary Western society, that's what we are here, our contemporary Western society, that the marketplace has become so dominant. And I would say with technology, like manipulative marketing, so dominant that we now have a consumer mentality that has bled into our covenantal relationships, our binding relationships, even marriage. And so today, we might stay connected to people only as long as they're meeting our needs, right? Or only as long as it's acceptable to us, but don't ask me to give just a little bit more. Like, don't ask for too much love or too much affirmation, because if we're not getting that back, then we just cut our losses.
Yeah, and this is super interesting to me because the more I've thought about it, the more I think in our culture with our consumer mentality, the more I'm like, man, I think we've actually begun to flip-flop those two things. So I think we talk about, for instance, brand loyalty. And what is brand loyalty except that, you know, we all know we're seduced by marketing. And so what happens is we agree with marketing to say, man, I'm going to be faithful to that brand. Like, these are brands that are so me. They're a part of my identity. I'm just an Apple guy. I'm a Coca-Cola guy. You know, whatever it is, Nike, Starbucks, Disney. I mean, you name it. And it's these companies that talk us into and basically tell us, be faithful to us. And we decide, you know what, even if they become the most expensive brand in that market, or even if they put out a bad product or two in a row, or even if I have a really bad customer service experience, I'll basically say it was probably that person, but that brand is still incredible. I will be faithful to that brand, even at times when they don't serve me well. And so for me, it's Jif peanut butter. Like, first off, man, that is like a party in my face. It's like heaven in my face. And I would pay twice as much for Jif peanut butter, because I'm faithful to it, than Peter Pan, okay?
Do they even make Peter Pan?
Yes, they do, but nobody's buying it because Jif, all right? And so, and if you quote me on this part, what I'm about to say right now, I will deny it in the future. But my brand loyalty is strongest to NFL logos. Now, here, just think about this for a second. I will deny this if you ask it again outside of this room. But 49ers, I grew up following the 49ers, the Cleveland Browns. They are companies, they're businesses, and the NFL loves when we create loyalty and identity wrapped around these things, because when it comes down to it, it's a business, it's a brand, it's a logo, and we will say things like, man, I've been faithful to Browns, even when Art Modell, Lucifer himself, took the Browns away from us, and we had to wait for it to come around, be resurrected from the empty tomb, and come back. I was faithful, and that is brand loyalty. And if you think about that, that is the definition of a covenant relationship. I will stay. I will pay for my season tickets no matter how long they suck. I will stay there even when they're not meeting my needs, and I leave depressed. So we're consumeristic with relationships with people, and we're increasingly covenantal in our relationships with brands and logos.
But here's what we know as we start talking about commitment, is that we know that in this audience, and we know that online, there are people who are divorced. There are people who have made mistakes in their marriage, and maybe their marriage is just barely holding on. Like, we know that. Yeah. That this message is not about making people feel guilty about stuff that's happened in the past. Like, you can't unscramble eggs. Thank goodness the Bible talks about God's mercies are new every single morning. Thank God, right? And so this isn't about making people feel guilty for what's already happened. This is more to give you hope for a future. And it's to say, it is possible to stay committed. It is possible.
Yeah, so we're going to Ephesians 5, which I love this passage. I think it's the coolest passage, just the deepest passage in Scripture about marriage, and it's written by a Christian leader named Paul in the first century. But one of the reasons it's so insightful and has so much depth is because it also reaches back to Genesis chapter 2, to the original marriage ceremony, and it quotes it in there, a ceremony performed by God for Adam and Eve, the first married couple. And so it's just this reminder inside of Ephesians 5, when it quotes Genesis 2, that, man, marriage was never man's idea. It's always been something that came from God, ordained from God since the beginning.
And what's great is it doesn't matter if you're single or married or divorced. It just has so much good stuff that we can learn from it. So let's read it. Ephesians 5:31. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united or cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh.
Yeah, so the reason we threw that in brackets is because that's like an old archaic English word that they used to translate this into in like the old King James version of the Bible way back in the day, before the 1980s even. And so basically, leave, the message was always leave. So leave your original, your parents, you kind of release from that. You leave them to start a new family unit, and you would cleave to your spouse. And so basically, you leave and cleave. I like it because it rhymes, okay? And I rap and I preach. So leave and cleave. Now, nobody should do commitment better than Northeast Ohio, because we are Cleveland. okay? So when it comes to commitment, no matter what the sacrifice, we should be saying, Cleveland, this is for you. You know, we should be saying, we're committed, man, no matter what. No matter how much we got to dig deep. He came back and he fulfilled that commitment, right? Okay, but then he left us again. Dang it. It's like a consumer relationship. So the Hebrew word found back in Genesis chapter 2 for this verse, cleave or be united, it means to be glued to something. And so, and we're not talking Elmer's. We're talking like super glue, crazy glue, gorilla glue kind of thing, you know? And so other places in the Bible, though, where that word for cleave is used, it means to unite something through a covenant. It means it's a binding promise, a binding oath. You glue yourself to that person, and it's permanent. It's a binding commitment. So you leave your parents, and you cleave to this new family. You cleave to your spouse until you both develop love handles. Okay, and then you cleave to those love handles. That's what you do.
So do me a favor. I want you to think about a traditional Christian wedding ceremony. And so in a traditional Christian wedding ceremony, you might have the bride and the groom, and they're standing there in front. You have some pastor, a minister of some sort, either standing here, maybe stand on the other side of them. And there is a set of questions that the minister will ask of both the man and the woman, right? He says, as they're looking at him, will you have this man, Shannon, we'll just make it me. Shannon, will you have this man to be your husband? To live together in holy covenant of marriage. Will you love him, comfort him, honor him, and care for him in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, be faithful to him as long as you both shall live? And he asks, if so, answer, I will. Or sometimes they'll say, I do. And Shannon says, I will. But have you ever noticed that during that first set of questions, you aren't actually speaking to each other, right? Like, who are you looking at? You're looking at the minister, and you're answering the question to him. And so why is that? Because what you're actually doing at that moment is making a vertical commitment, a vertical covenant, a vertical vow to God. Because that minister is God's representative at that time. Isn't that cool? So at that moment, when you say, I will, you're making a vow to God, and then you turn to each other and say your vows. So first it's vertical, and then it's horizontal. You're building on that foundation, right? That wedding vows, even when you get to the vows, it's not even a declaration of our love at the present, but our love at the future. It's a mutually binding promise for your future love, regardless of your fickle emotions, because we know we all have them, regardless of health, regardless of your undulating, I like him, I don't like him, I like him, I really don't like him, I like him. No, you know, these undulating feelings that we have, or even the things, external circumstances, regardless of that.
Yeah, and of course we're talking about other couples with undulating feelings.
Sure.
We're always hot for each other. So,
Sure.
But in Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis, who, if you've been around here, you know is one of my favorite authors. Mere Christianity, famous book from him. He talks about how there are kind of two different loves, though, when you're talking about being in love with someone, when there's someone you love. And so he talks about this first kind, the being in love. Like, it's that feeling in the first sermon of the series. I talked about that. It just feels like it's everything. Oh my gosh, this person, it's all that's on the earth. I mean, it's all I care about. It's eternal, it's cosmic, it's incredible. And that's that feeling that happens when you fall in love, when you're in love. But you can't promise a feeling, right? Like, you can't maintain that feeling all the time. It's a good thing, but it's not the best thing. It doesn't last, it won't last, it can't last. So, I mean, the Righteous Brothers told you this. Right? Okay? You've lost that love and feeling. Where did it go, baby? Where did it go? And so the second kind that he then talks about, and this is what I want you to think about when you think about commitment, covenantal love, is love as a commitment. Love is an action. Love is a sacrificial commitment for the good of the other. And he talks about this. He says this, Lewis writes, love in the second sense is not merely a feeling. It's a deep unity, the two become one, maintained by the will and deliberately strengthened by habit. They can have this love for each other even at those moments where they don't like each other. They can retain this love even when they would easily, if they allowed themselves, be in love with someone else. Man, this is so powerful because it describes beyond the emotional feeling, beyond that, the honeymoon's over. Then there's this burning commitment that's slow burning. It's a decision. It's an act of the will. It's a habit. And that first love is explosion. It's just like, oh my gosh, it's everything. It's so great. But that moves you toward because of this emotional explosion, I want to move toward a covenant that when this explosion wears off, we're going to be committed to each other, no matter what. So the second love is a quieter love of commitment. C.S. Lewis says, it's on this second love that the engine of marriage is run, and that's a covenant relationship.
Yeah, so otherwise it's less about, true love is less about emotions, which I think we all have heard before and know. It's less about emotions, and it's more about unified, habitual, I love that he used the word habit, habitual action within a commitment over and over and over. Keep doing these things, dating and serving and forgiving and encouraging and being intimate with one another, even when you don't feel like it.
Yeah. So several years ago in Christianity Today, there was an article by a Christian ethicist. From now on, you can just start calling me an ethicist. His name's Lewis Smedes. Don't call me Smedes. So I want to be an ethicist, but I don't want to be a Smedes. But he wrote an article called The Power of Promising. And I love how he describes his role as a husband, his role as a man in his marriage. He says, when I married my wife, I hardly had a smidgen of sense for what I was getting into with her. He said, how could I know how much she would change over 25 years, which is the mark we're almost at? How could I know how much I would change, he says. My wife has lived with at least 5 different men since we were wed. And each of the 5 has been me. The connecting link with my old self, the one who took those vows, has always been the memory of the name I took on back there. I am he who will be there with you. When we slough off that name, he says, lose that identity, we can hardly find ourselves again. So the idea is to say, man, I guarantee you, you and your spouse are going to change. In fact, it's a given that marriage itself will change you. You will change because of the marriage relationship. But in the wedding vows, you make a vertical covenant to God and you make a horizontal covenant to one another to say, okay, listen, I won't bail on you. I won't give up. I won't be unfaithful to you when I fall out of emotional love with you. I'll discipline my attractions and emotions to defend our marriage from outside threats, no matter what. I am he who will be there with you. That's no matter what. That's a covenant. And Smead says, I love this. He says, when you make this promise to someone, he says this, you have created a small sanctuary of trust within the jungle of unpredictability. I think that's beautiful because that's what covenant looks like. I am he who will be there with you.
And I think, a lot of us might understand and realize people say the first year of marriage is the hardest. And it is the hardest, but it's also not many divorces happen in that first year because you're still riding the emotions, because you're still willing to try. I found it interesting that in Relevant Magazine, they said it's years 5 through 7 that tend to get people problems. And why is that? Well, sometimes kids have entered the picture.
Yeah, babies.
You've had time to get into some financial problems. Communication has broken down. And honest to goodness, sometimes you just get sick of each other. You annoy each other. 5, 7 years, that's a long time.
And if you're not careful and if you're not aware of this, you can become a serial lover. And I don't mean like, man, I love Cocoa Puffs. I mean like a serial killer, but a serial lover. And what that means is if you don't pay attention to this and watch this in yourself, then eventually you get to this point where you go through relationship after relationship or even marriage after marriage because you'll realize I'm going through the same cycles. And the cycle is this. It's infatuation. Oh my gosh, love is everything. This person is everything. I feel so good when I'm with you. You make me feel like a man. You make me feel like a woman. And then after infatuation, disillusionment. That might be in that 5 to 7 year mark of a marriage of like, man, this person kind of annoys the crap out of me. They do things that I didn't, and there's disillusion, like, this isn't perfect. I've fallen out of love. I don't have the emotions. Then rejection, and then flight to someone new. And this can happen over and over and over again, and the impasse is the disillusionment part, and that can cause you to become, if you're not aware of it, a serial lover.
So it's our 11-year anniversary. And by this time, we've moved to Cleveland. We have our 3 little ones. Momentum has started. Dan was actually finishing up his master's, and we had the night off because we got a babysitter, and we're going out for dinner to celebrate our 11-year milestone, which we were really happy about getting. So while we're at dinner, we decided to go to P.F. Chang's.
That's a P.F. Chang's, y'all.
Yeah, so over our wonton soup, whatever that was, Dan starts talking and saying the things that he always says. Shannon, I love you so much. I can't believe we've made it to 11 years, and we both couldn't believe that we made it, as well as many of our friends who we are pretty sure, because of our dating relationship being so up and down, that they placed bets on how many months we would last. Not years, just months.
We run into them. They're like, "You're still married?"
I know. So there we are, and Dan's like saying, it's been 11 years. I can't believe it's been 11 years. It's been 11 years, and I love you so much. And something happened inside of me. Like, something inside of me, like, I just started breathing, and I felt suffocated. And in my mind, all I kept thinking was, 11 years. Like, it's been 11 years. I can't breathe. I feel trapped. Now, I'm not showing him this, but as he's talking and saying the things that every woman wants to hear, I'm inside dying a little bit, feeling like I'm breaking. I was like, oh my gosh, what are the things that I've missed? Like, what are the other things I could be doing right now? Oh my gosh, this is the rest of my life. I thought it was just a fluke, honestly. I went home, thought it was just a fluke, totally freaked me out, but it would not leave me. And months went by, and these what ifs started getting in my mind. Like, what if we wouldn't have gotten married? Like, what would I be doing right now? And the funny thing is, the things that would pop into my head of the things I thought what I would be doing were always better than my real life. Like, the grass is always greener, even though we know that's not true. Like, what if I decided, like, I'd be sitting there, what if I decided maybe I should have pursued singing a little bit earlier? What would I do with that? Where would I be? Like, what if I want to do something later on and I can't do it because I'm trapped? Like, what if, and this was the scariest, honest to goodness to me, like, what if I don't want to do this anymore? And I had a good life. I had a husband who's head over heels in love with me, and he lets everybody know. You guys know that. He lets everybody know all the time. I had 3 amazing miracle children that I didn't even think we'd be able to have. And in those moments, for months and months and months, I just started like this what-if game in my mind, and I learned the hard way that living the life of the what-ifs is a commitment killer, because it was slowly eating away at my relationship with Dan and my relationship with my family. I was learning the hard way, and so I made myself, I guess it was about a year later, I don't know, you were traveling, maybe finishing up his master's degree, and I found myself, I'd put the kids to bed, and it was so strong in my mind that I put on one of Dan's shirts. Like, I'm like, I'll just put on his shirt, put on one of Dan's shirts. I sat on the couch, and I just cried and screamed into a pillow because I was so scared that I was so close to leaving. Even my perfect life, that I was so scared that I was about to do what I said and I promised that I would not do. And so I know sometimes we think of commitment and we talk about anniversaries and how long you've been married, and it's like the pictures that it conjures up are things like wedding rings and kisses and dates, and it's wonderful. And
Old people on the beach.
Old people on the beach, and they're holding hands, la la la. But sometimes it looks like somebody's sitting on a couch screaming into a pillow trying to hold on. Okay, because that's what commitment looked like to me in those moments. And we're talking, I went through this for like a year until I finally was like, oh my gosh, I am really close to doing this. And it scared the heck out of me. So I called 2 of my best friends who lived hours and hours away, and I said, girls, is there any way in the next couple weeks you can meet up with me? And they drove hours to meet me in this diner in Pennsylvania. And we all drove hours, and I tell them, like, I've got this great life, And why do I want out? Just tell me. Is it normal? Like, is this normal? And both of them said, they're so amazing. And like, yeah, like we've been there. We've done this. We know, like, yes, it's totally normal. And it just made me feel like we need to talk about sometimes, even in a great marriage, you're going to have those feelings of maybe wanting out, even when you have an amazing life. And for me, it didn't come at year 5 to 7, and I wonder if it's because it took us almost 6 years to have Zion, our oldest, and so it seemed to prolong. Maybe it's just a theory that I have of why that was for me. And when they started looking at my life and I started talking about my life, I was emotionally and physically exhausted. Like, we had moved, we had started momentum, we had 3 kids, like 3.5 and under, and I was so tired. And Satan preyed on it. Like, he got into my mind, and that's what he does when we're at our most vulnerable. Like, when you're tired, when you're struggling, when you're stressed, when you're depressed, when your spouse isn't, maybe for some people, taking as good care of you as you want, and Satan comes in and he preys on that, and he gets in your mind with these what ifs. What if? What if? I'm sure it would be better. And yes, my friends told me it was normal, but as one of my friends said, my good friend Mary Foss, she said, just because it's normal doesn't make it right. And so I knew when I left my friends that I had lots of changes that I needed to make. And I came home, and I remember laying in bed with Dan crying, and I just told him, I am not well. Like, I am not well. And I immersed myself in books and resources that dealt with marriage, family, and God. And I told myself, until I deal with this, I will not read or listen to or watch anything else unless it's helping me in my marriage and my family and with my God. I continued to talk to my friends who really held me accountable, and I had to have this whatever it takes mentality, but it took another 6 months for me to weather that storm.
Yeah, we're super complex, aren't we? Like our emotions and all that kind of stuff. But by round of applause, how many of you have ever read Homer's The Odyssey? Anybody ever read that? Okay. How many of you can pronounce it? I can pull that off. Like, pronounce it. All right, so it's basically an epic, Greek epic poem, ancient, and it's about Ulysses in Latin or Odysseus in Greek. So Ulysses, and it's basically him sailing home after the Trojan War is over. And at one point, Ulysses is warned that he's going to have to pass the island of Sirens, speaking of brand loyalty to Starbucks, for instance, but like the island of Sirens. So the Sirens appeared to be beautiful women with these incredible singing voices, and they would sit beside the ocean on the beach of their island, and they would comb their long golden hair, and they would sing enticing melodies to the sailors that were riding by. And anyone who heard their song, they would go temporarily insane. They'd be bewitched by these songs, and they would turn their ships toward the island, and their ships would smash upon the rocks. So in reality, the Sirens were beautiful but deadly monsters. And so what happened is when Ulysses knew they were coming to the point where they would pass the island of the Sirens, he knew that he would go mad if he heard the voices of the Sirens. But he also knew that that insanity would be temporary, only while he was in earshot of the Sirens. So he took like candle wax and he put it in the ears of all of his sailors. He tied himself to the mast of the ship, and he told his men that they needed to stay on course no matter what. And so their ship sped forward past the island until the song of the Sirens was just an echo of an echo in the background. So the point is, Ulysses didn't want to do something while he was temporarily insane that would have permanent consequences. Now, this is super cool because long-term studies have shown that 2/3 of unhappy marriages will become happy within 5 years if they don't divorce. Long-term studies have shown 2/3 of unhappy marriages will become happy within the next 5 years if they don't divorce. So how in the world do you prepare for those rough patches at year 11 or years 5 through 7 or when you fall out of love after year 1? How do you prepare for those rough patches? How do you get through the disillusionment? You've got to tie yourself to the mast. You have got to tie yourself to the mast until your mind clears and you begin to understand things better and those emotions settle down. You think more clearly. Instead of saying, I browsed 8 sites for divorce attorneys today.
I browsed 8 sites for divorce attorneys today.
Have you seen that commercial? Okay. So
It's a commercial,
yeah, it's
I
like
don't know.
instead of doing that, you say, okay, I am going to hold on to the mast. I'm going to stay on course. I'm going to steer clear of danger. And I'm not going to browse 8 sites for divorce attorneys today. I'm going to stay committed no matter what because that's covenantal. I promised that.
Yeah, and it's difficult when you're tying yourself to the mast. It's not that you're not going to have temptation. It's just that you're refusing. And that's one reason even I wanted to tell my story is because I wish I would have heard someone else previously tell their story to tell me, man, it can come out of nowhere. Be ready.
Yeah. So when it comes to affair-proofing your marriage, that's a whole nother, we got a couple things that we're like, we'll save that for a whole nother message so that we're not here until the next Browns game, okay? And so when it comes to affair-proofing your marriage, here are just 3 basic little ways that human nature fights that set the course for long-term commitment. Number 1, say to your spouse, I'm in this no matter what. Like, I'm staying with you. I'm he who will be there with you. I am in this no matter what. 2, never mention divorce. Never bring it up in an argument. Never use it as a threat that forces you to find other options when you hit an obstacle. How else are we going to get through this together? Number 3, as silly as it sounds, always wear your wedding ring. I can't even tell you how many times I've had guys tell me, oh, I can't wear my wedding ring. Since we got married, I got hot dog fingers. Well, get your ring adjusted, get a brand new ring, get a tattoo of a ring, but always, because basically what that does is that sends the message before the siren even starts singing. Sometimes it deflects temptation that you won't even know would have been there because you're always showing that you're married.
And maybe especially if you're upset with your spouse and you really are thinking of divorce, and the thought of hurting them doesn't really hurt you, make a list of everybody who's going to be affected if you break this commitment, this covenant, this binding. Like, make a list. And I promise it might be pages long of the people that will be affected. Sometimes that's the motivation that's tying you down.
Yeah, we've had some people that we've kind of looked to. They've been official mentors, or other times just people we've watched and been inspired by. Always older couples. I made fun of the older generation earlier, but that's all just in jest. We love old people. We love young people. Anyways, we have people that we look to who are older than us that we've been like, man, I love the relationship they have. And sometimes they're in ministry because they would have similar struggles. Some of them have been Tom and Debbie Jones, who you guys don't know yet. Hopefully you do one day. Tim and Lisa Jones. Pretty much anyone whose last name is Jones. Clint and Kiana here at Momentum. We're watching you. Real creepily, we're watching you. But Tim Jones is significantly older than me. He's several years older than me, but he's been one of my buddies for a long time. And we have dug into real honesty, real true with each other about struggles with pornography and lust and our marriages and communication. I mean, we haven't held anything back. And I'll never forget one day when I was in my late 20s, we were riding around the suburbs of D.C. where we both lived. And we're riding around, he said something to me about his marriage with Lisa. They're way ahead of me. And he says, man, I know you might not even believe this right now, but here's the deal. Like, when I think about the idea of being with another, because of our commitment to each other and me trying to focus on exclusively her for so long, the thought of being with another, it's almost becoming kind of gross to me. And I just remember thinking, man, that was such a great thing to see in the fast forward of his journey. And now the funny thing is, I'm now older than he was when he told me that. And I'm like, man, you know what else? Portion sizes are becoming a big deal to me right now, too. But that was so good to hear from him. It was the hope of, if you tie yourself to the mast and you keep fighting the battle of temptation and the temptation for pornography, lust, you wear your ring, you don't threaten divorce, you say no matter what, you tie yourself to the mast, plug your ears with wax, this is what it'll eventually look like, this maturity of the commitment. And it becomes easier over time. Now, one thing, another kind of caveat that we don't have time for today, but I do want to mention it, is God does make it clear, like, hey, you can't just divorce for any reason. I mean, man, this is a binding commitment, glued to each other. You guys are binding in a covenant, but there are 2 reasons in Scripture it says that divorce is okay. And it says, if someone has really broken this covenant, Jesus says divorce is not permitted except for sexual immorality, or other versions say marital unfaithfulness is how that's translated. So adultery. And then Paul, who wrote Ephesians 5, he says, in the case of willful desertion, your spouse abandons you, then the wronged spouse is no longer bound in that binding covenant commitment. But here's the deal, we don't have time to cover divorce in this sermon a bunch, but divorce is terribly difficult. And one of the reasons is because of that image from Genesis 2 and Ephesians 5. The two have become one. So when a divorce happens, there's this tearing, and it's like halves walk away from this, and it takes spiritual healing to heal from a divorce.
Yeah, and we understand that commitment, and we want you to understand, commitment isn't just about affair-proofing your marriage. It's not just about not getting divorced, right? It is possible to be in a binding covenantal relationship, a commitment, and love it,
Yeah.
and to be happy. And a lot of times, we've been married 24 years now, and over the last few years, a lot of people will come up to us and be like, oh man, we want what you have, because we have a great marriage, and we want people to see that. But sometimes when they're saying that, they're looking for an excuse to get out of theirs, because maybe they don't feel like it is great. Or they're just disillusioned of, they are not seeing the 2 breakups that were horrendous that we went through in college.
Awful.
They're not seeing the counseling that we have both been through at different times. They're not seeing the months and years that it took us to learn how to fight without cussing each other out and hitting walls and slamming doors. They're not seeing that. They're not seeing the rows and rows and rows of books on our shelves that we have read, and the money that we have invested so that we can have a good marriage. They're not seeing the forgiveness that we have had to work through with each other time and time again. They're not seeing that. Mm-hmm. They're not seeing the cassettes that we listen to. Light her fire, light his fire.
Light her fire. That says commitment right there.
We've
been committed since the era of cassette tapes, y'all. That says, man, these guys have been doing it a while.
But you have to understand, there is no shortcut. It is a habit. Covenant. It's a habit that you have to get into, investing in. And so I just want to ask people, when they say that, we want what you have, and I want to say, are you willing to work at it? Are you willing to?
Yeah, and I love just to wrap this up, the secret revealed in Ephesians 5 that I alluded to in week 1 is this really beautiful secret that the gospel, the good news story of Jesus, God in the flesh coming to earth, dying on the cross for us, rising from the dead, that the gospel of Jesus and marriage, they explain one another. It says, Paul says in Ephesians 5, this is a mystery. It says it in another part of the Bible too. I think it's 1 Corinthians 7, that this is a mystery. They explain one another. The gospel helps us understand marriage, and the marriage in turn helps us understand the gospel. So in Ephesians 5, Paul says marriage should be modeled after. We should look to the gospel, Jesus and his sacrificial love, laying down his life for his bride, the church, and that's sacrificial love for the good of the other. So what does sacrificial love look like when it comes to this commitment? This is what sacrificial love looks like. It's that Jesus on the cross was in agony, and he looks down from the cross at people denying him and abandoning him and betraying him. And in the greatest act of love in history, he stayed. It basically alludes to in Scripture, he could have called on legions of angels to come handle this moment, to wipe out the Roman soldiers, to leave a crater in the hill called Golgotha. I mean, he could have done any of that, but instead, he stayed. In fact, he prayed, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. And so in this beautiful picture, he loved us not because we were lovely. He loved us and died for us to make us lovely in the sacrificial act of love. And so, what we should say when we're in a covenantal relationship is that, the cross, that is why and that is how I'm going to love my spouse. I will stay no matter what and work on this because this is how love handles commitment. Let's pray.